Hello and welcome back to another Redwall review. Today I am discussing Loamhedge, which is the 16th book in the series. I mean, I can't believe it, and I just around a year I have read 16 of these books. I remember when I read this as a kid being kind of disappointed by it, only that the title of this book is Loamhedge, and fans of the series will know that Loamhedge is this abbey that existed before Redwall. It is where Redwall's first mother, Abbess Germain, came from. So when I saw the title of this book, I was really hoping Brian Jacques was finally revisiting some of his own old characters. Maybe it was going to be a prequel about Abbess Germain. Unfortunately, no. Like most of the later Redwall books, it's set in a standalone generation. We only see these characters in this book. I'm pretty sure we never see them again later. And the reason why it's called Loamhedge is that the quest takes the characters back to the historic Loamhedge architectural site. There's certainly some brief mentions of the past of the character of Abbess Germain and the mice she lived amongst at Loamhedge, though sadly no mention of Columbine. There's also mention of Matthias and Matimio and Tim Churchmouse, these characters that journeyed to the architectural site of Loamhedge years after Loamhedge, but years before the events of this book. But otherwise, this, like many Redwall books, is set in a standalone generation for better or for worse. And as is always the case when discussing these books, does Brian Jacques do anything to set this one apart, to make it special, given that he sort of returns to those familiar patterns in every book? He works with the same species. They pretty much always fill the same personality types, the same moral niches. And basically, the feeling I had with Loamhedge is, if you've been, as I am doing, reading, all these books at once, I don't think this one does enough to set itself apart. That said, if you read it as a standalone book, I think it should still be pretty enjoyable. And there are some interesting choices made here. But again, they're interesting choices within the context of a series where I think Brian Jacques intentionally did not shake things up too much because he felt his readers like the comfort of familiarity. I actually really like the opening of this book. It's set in this sort of isolated little otter community. There's a stormy yet cozy ambiance going on, and the story is told from the perspective of this child otter who's maybe first learning to admire the adult members of his family, and he discovers this abandoned, left for dead badger out on the street, who unsurprisingly turns out to be a very dangerous but benevolent warrior, Lana Bowstripe. Now, unfortunately, after the first third of this book, we never see these otters again. And maybe that's not so bad because I can't imagine Brian Jacques would do anything too interesting with them, but I really like that ambiance. And I think it's a shame that these characters who had a bit of distinct personality felt like a bit of their own world. We don't get to see them. And instead, we get to see the character of the vengeful badger, which we've seen so many times by this point. Now, this character of Lana Bowstripe, he is a bit different only in that he's more extreme than the other badgers. So a recurring theme in the books throughout the series is most of the badgers suffer from a condition called blood wrath, which is when they get passion for justice, they become angered by something that's done wrong to them, they kind of go into berserker mode and indiscriminately kill their enemies. And it's always kind of implied they might also kill innocence, though they never seem to do that. Brian Jacques kind of conveniently leaves that ambiguous. And what's different about Lana Bowstripe from some of the other characters is a lot of the other Badgers up to this point, Sunflash, especially Sagax in the previous book, Triss, lots of the time they might seem relatable and nonchalant, and the blood wrath is sort of an exceptional state. Whereas Lana, I mean, he's still a benevolent character. He's still nice to other good characters, including the little otter at the beginning. But he enjoys going into the blood wrath. He makes speeches at his targets about how justice has to be played out, how he has to kill them to accomplish his goals. And in fact, what's kind of explicitly a bit dark about him is he's not just happy to kill the boss villain. He has to kill every single one of the boss villain's minions, whether they are really individually bad or not. The next protagonist of the book we get to know is a hare called Martha Braybuck. Martha Braybuck is in a wheelchair, which is an interesting choice. One might think of wheelchairs as relatively modern technology, and this is a book set in medieval times. Now, it's quite possible, I'm not going to do historical research for this video, that variants of the wheelchair might go quite far back. But it feels like a very interesting premise. So much of the Redwall series is about characters going out on these long quests, and one wonders how this character in a wheelchair is going to manage. It might force Brian Jakes to sort of write new visions of his journeys. These sort of steps along the way that were more mundane for other characters might require different challenges for Martha. He might have to write about them in different ways. Another thing that stands out about Martha is that even though she is a hare, I think she's the first hare in the series who does not speak in the standard hare accent, which is basically a posh British accent that loses a lot of jolly old what's. Now, part of the reason Martha doesn't have this accent is she is an orphaned hare who's lived all her life at Redwall Abbey. But that's only part of the explanation because she has an older brother named Hortwill, or Horty for short, who is a much more stereotypical Redwall hare, and he was only slightly older than Martha when he arrives at the Abbey. So clearly, it's not just that Martha wasn't raised amongst hares to explain why she doesn't have the accent. There's this implication that she's this outsider character. She doesn't quite fit in, and part of it is her disability, but part of it is something maybe about her mind works. It feels like she's being set up to be a very interesting protagonist in the story. The next key protagonists we meet are an otter and a squirrel traveling together named Bragoon and Saro. They're kind of interesting in that they're described as late middle age, so I guess the equivalent about 60 years old. And they left Redwall when they were very young, and they're brave, heroic warriors, but also a little mischievous, had some real maturity issues when they were younger. And I feel while Brian Jakes has occasionally had older characters like Joseph the Bellmaker go on quests before, it's always just like a weird background piece of trivia that doesn't factor into the characters, how the characters are written. Where with Bragoon and Saro, I feel like Brian actually does give them some real three-dimensionality. There are little moments where they become insecure about the fact that they used to be quite immature and they still are quite reckless, even if they are now these seasoned warriors who others look up to. They're always thinking, we're strong right now, we're great fighters, but one of these days we're going to fail. I feel like in some ways the writing is a bit too realistic, a bit too subtle to bring necessary energy into the story, but I do think Bragoon and Saro are well thought out characters. Anyway, Bragoon and Saro arrive at Redwall, and Martin appears in a dream as he always does, and basically Martha figures out that she might be able to recover her ability to walk if a cure is discovered at the ancient Loamhedge Abbey. And Martin tells her in a dream that Bragoon and Saro have to go out on a quest to find this. So Bragoon and Saro do that, but then they're met along the way by Martha's older brother, Horty, and his friends, the mouse maid Springald and the squirrel maid Fenna. And up to this point, there's a lot of implications that despite being the older brother, Horty is really immature, more so really than any character we've seen. He comes up with this plan to almost drown some Redwall babies as a distraction so he can run away. So he's an interestingly flawed Piro. Again, a more three-dimensional character than we've seen in the series so far. And basically, he and his friends sneak along with the journey to try and join Bragoon and Saro on their quest. Bragoon and Saro are forced to take them along, and there's this interesting interplay where Horty is a real problem along the way, but Bragoon and Saro can never fully denounce him because they remember in some ways they used to be like Horty. Now, unfortunately, this is kind of where the story disappointed me because it felt like what was really interesting at the beginning is we were going to see what are we going to do with Martha, this character who has to interact with the world in a different way. And unfortunately, Martha just stays at the Abbey. Brian does not challenge himself to really work with the wheelchair thing. Unfortunately, it feels like he's going to do the predictable thing we saw in the tag rug, for instance, where you have a brother and a sister, and the brother becomes the great warrior eventually, and the sister becomes the peacetime leader of Redwall Abbey. It doesn't quite work out that simply, but I will get there eventually. So I've talked about all our protagonists, but this book, being a Redwall book, of course, also has to have some villains. And that's one of the things, again, that's quite interesting about this. The main villain is not interesting. He's a sea rat named Ragabol. You barely notice him for much of the book. He's pretty generic. I feel like he gets much less screen time than other Redwall villains in the series. But we also have this other group of villains, this traveling group of Redwall vermin who journey through the woods. And first they're led by this weasel named Burad, but within a couple pages he's killed and a fox named Scrod takes over. And then before too long he's killed and a rat named Dargle takes over. Before finally the character you never see coming, spoiler alert, this fox with the unusual name for Redwall of Little Red takes over. It's just this adorable image, this fox with this silly, cute name described as a little fox, which is a funny thing in itself, given that many of the vermin creatures in theory would be much smaller than foxes. And he quickly has to transform himself. He changes his name to Bad Red. I don't know if he was intentionally naming himself after Bad Rang, but he doesn't want to be Little Red anymore. Basically, he just seizes power based on opportunism and lying that he was the one who avenged the death of the previous chief, and he's clearly not qualified to lead. One of his minions is a stoat named Flinky, and I remembered Flinky being my favorite character in this book as a kid. It's like the one thing I remembered all about this book. But Flinky actually, he was a much more prominent character than I even remembered and really unique in some ways. Firstly, he's married to another stoat named Crinktail. I don't think I picked up on that as a kid because they referred to Crinktail as his mate, and I thought back then it was like mate as in shipmate, but no, I'm pretty sure it means his wife. And usually when vermin are married in this series, you never understand why they get married in the first place because they're just fighting and threatening to kill each other all the time. Whereas Flinky and Crinktail, I mean, I don't know if they love each other, but they definitely seem to be happy best friends. And Flinky is just this big goofball who sings a lot of songs and tries to find ways to get the vermin to just be lazy and eat food rather than actually go on evil missions. But unlike other adorkable villains before, like Blaggett or Grubbage, there's not an implication that Flinky is naive or stupid at all. He's all the while actually doing some things that are quite clever. So he ends up being one of the most interesting characters in the series, and I think one that probably gets forgotten because this is, again, the 16th book in the series, and it's a book that's struggling to have a unique voice. Even as I'm, realizing as I'm talking about it, it does make a lot of original choices. So one of the things that's a bit awkward with this book is the pacing of it. Again, it takes a while establishing who the main villain is. You barely get to know Ragabol. The book is kind of conflicted. Is Martha the protagonist? It kind of loses interest in her. Is Lana Bowstripe the protagonist? I mean, he gets some great scenes, but again, just another angry badger. It's hard to like him too much. Bragoon and Saro, accompanied by Hordy and his friends, ends up being the most relatable group of protagonists, but it takes them till basically the end of the book until they actually get to Loamhedge Abbey. And once they get there, Brian Jiggs doesn't really know what to do with them. They don't end up finding any cure. Spoiler alert, in order to inspire Martha, Bragoon and Saro just decide to write on a piece of paper that, the cure is determination, which I imagine is just meant to sort of inspire her. But obviously not the most creative solution, and could be interpreted as offensive, though I think a more charitable interpretation is certainly possible. And it turns out Martha just miraculously, in sort of a moment of divine inspiration, regains the ability to walk anyway. So Brian Jakes came up with a cool idea and then didn't know what to do with it, and it's really frustrating.
Now, Redwall Wiki comes up with the explanation that Martha has what's called psychosomatic paralysis. That is, she never suffered a physical condition, it was all coming from her mind. This could have been an interesting choice. I just wish it was explained more directly, because as is, it just comes across as the problem solves itself for no reason, rather than it actually being an exploration of this condition.
But yes, basically the Bragoon and Saro plot ends up being very rushed. They run in towards the end of the book of this character called a Werit, and I think it just means a half weasel, half ferret, but it's based on this character from Madame Mayo, and that character was more supposed to be a Frankensteinian monster, a sort of pun on the word werewolf, whereas it didn't have that cool energy this time. It was just all a bit rushed. But as the book reaches its end, there manages to be one more really interesting choice. And that is, as is often the case, the book ends with a young creature being named Redwall's next abbot/abbess. And it's really set up for you to expect that creature to be Hordy. Spoiler alert, it ends up being one of Hordy's friends, Fenna the squirrel. And that's a very surprising choice because, as I said, it felt like it was really setting it up for Martha to be the abyss. It felt like she was written exactly the way characters like Mira and Song and Tansy had been written before her. Whereas Fenna is a relatively minor character, but despite being minor, she and Springle the Mouse have a bit of an arc where, despite being Horty's best friends and going out on this troublesome quest together, they actually rise to the occasion and are compassionate and thoughtful and try to learn from Bragoon and Saro along the way, whereas Horty is a bit stuck up and matures more slowly. So it's kind of an interesting, inspired choice that Brian Jakes gives this only sort of major character this important promotion. It's an interesting realism. It's saying, sometimes the great hero is not just the character you're most paying attention to, it's this quiet leader character. So, overall, definitely some interesting choices in this book. I think the failure to do much with Martha serves as a bit of a distraction, and the pacing serves as a bit of a distraction. But at the same time, given that this is a series that's criticized for the black and whiteness of its characters, what it does with characters like Flinky and even the other vermin he works with, including Bad Red, is much more three-dimensional than we've seen in other characters in the
series.
what it does with Horty as a main character, someone who doesn't just instantly rise to the occasion the way Madame Mayo did in his book. He was immature at the beginning and quickly grew up. You know, Horty, it clearly he needs until the epilogue to grow up, and even then he might be a true troublemaker. So there's really good writing in here. It's just there's something about it that doesn't come together as a whole. So let me know your thoughts on Loamhedge, and I look forward to coming back to you with a review of Rackety Tam sometime soon.